As we continue this journey through the Passion narratives from the Gospel of John, I'd invite you and your group to turn to the 19th chapter. I want to read the first 16 or so verses of the 19th chapter. Then Pilate had Jesus taken and whipped. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and dressed him in a purple robe. Over and over they went up to him and said, "Greetings, King of the Jews," and they slapped him in the face. Pilate came out of the palace again and said to the Jewish leaders, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no grounds for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here's the man." When the chief priests and their deputies saw him, they shouted out, "Crucify, crucify." Pilate told them, "You take him and crucify him. I don't find any grounds for a charge against him." The Jewish leaders replied, "We have a law, and according to this law, he ought to die because he made himself out to be God's son." When Pilate heard this word, he was even more afraid. He went back into the residence and spoke to Jesus. "Where are you from?" Jesus didn't answer, so Pilate said, "You won't speak to me. Don't you know that I have authority to release you and also to crucify you?" Jesus replied, "You would have no authority over me if it had not been given to you from above. That's why the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin." From that moment on, Pilate wanted to release Jesus. However, the Jewish leaders cried out, saying, "If you release this man, you aren't a friend of the emperor. Anyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes the emperor." When Pilate heard these words, he led Jesus out and seated him on the judge's bench at the place called Stone Pavement, in Aramaic, Gabbatha. It was about noon on the preparation day for the Passover. Pilate said to the Jewish leaders, "Here's your king." The Jewish leaders cried out, take him away, crucify him." Pilate responded, "What? Do you want me to crucify your king?" "We have no king except the emperor," the chief priests answered. Then Pilate handed Jesus over to be crucified. In the text for last week, we looked at what is really a political text. Jesus standing before Pilate, two kings, if you will, vying for power. Pilate, the symbol of Roman authority. Jesus, the symbol of ultimate eternal authority. And we explored the ways in which, in that text, we're invited to a kind of politic the world doesn't see. That it's a profoundly political text, but not a left or right kind of politics. In fact, that's the very kind of politics Pilate vies for. But it invites us into a deeper reality, a deeper politic, a deeper community, the community that reflects the purposes and desires of the Father. That text continues on. And as we look at this conclusion to the trial before Pilate, we probably have to do that with an Old Testament text in mind, in particular, Isaiah chapter 53. I won't read it to you, but I would invite you to explore it together, maybe in your group. Isaiah 53 is that famous text about the suffering servant who is wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities, who by his stripes we are healed. A tradition developed in the prophets, and in particular in the book of Isaiah, as the people of God in the Old Testament wrestled with why had they endured so much suffering. If they were God's chosen people, if this is the people that God chose to reveal himself to the world through, then why have they gone through so much? Why do they continue to endure such suffering? Why do they end up in exile and persecution? Well, one answer to that the prophets give is because oftentimes their hearts were hard. They sinned and they were reaping the consequences of their own sinfulness and unfaithfulness. But the other answer that the prophets began to develop, and we see it most clearly in Isaiah 53, is that perhaps this deeper politic, if you will, this deeper community that Israel is discovering as God's people, maybe that has to do with undoing some things in the world. And because of that undoing, then that people are forced to endure hardship, persecution, distress, that they will be a suffering servant for the Lord. Maybe we can think of it this way. I often talk about the way kings and kingdoms come. There's a repetition in history. A kingdom conquers through war and violence and extends their territory, and they exist for a while until someone rises up from within or an empire comes from without. We have a war, violence. That emperor and that empire expand their territory till another kingdom comes and they conquer them. And it's like this repetitive cycle of history, of conquest, of war, of violence. And one of the questions that we have to wrestle with, and especially in the Old Testament, is how are we going to end that cycle? How are we going to break that cycle of, if you knock out my tooth, I knock out your teeth, which then means you poke out my eye, which means I then burn down your village. How are we going to end this sort of cycle of retribution and violence? When do we finally come to a place where we say, that's enough, it's over? The only way to do that is for a suffering servant to come along, to be the one who says, you may act this way, but I'm not going to act back to you in like form. You may knock out my tooth. You may slap me on the cheek, but I'm going to turn the left cheek as well. You may force me to go 1 mile, but then I'll go 2. You may think you're my enemy, but I'm going to then treat you like my neighbor. But to do that invites us into what theologians would call a kind of redemptive suffering. So that the prophets begin to imagine their lives in this kind of way, that part of the reason Israel is suffering is because they are embodying a way of life that the world doesn't know. And as they live that life out, as they especially learn the ways of peace, learn the ways of grace, learn the ways of forgiveness, it's going to constantly invite them not to retribution, not to revenge. It's going to invite them into a suffering for the sake of the world. Wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. But here's the key: by his stripes we are healed. That by his stripes that life will end. And the prophets begin to imagine Israel's life in that, but they begin to imagine a sort of messianic expectation in that. And so with those texts in mind, then as we read this text, we begin to see that there's powerful theology of Jesus as the suffering servant. I love, by the way, that in this text, Pilate says 2 theological things that I'm not sure he realizes he says, but John wants to capture them. First, he says about Jesus, here is the man. But then on the other hand, he says, here is your king. From the get-go in the Gospel of John, John wanted us to see that this is the Word made flesh. This is, when we look at Jesus, we see the fullness of what humankind is supposed to be, but we also see the fullness of what God looks like. And Pilate seems to acknowledge that. We see some tensions in this text. Pilate is the embodiment of authority. Even though we're learning a deeper politic, there's still a place, I would argue, for authorities, for structures in the world. But more often than not, the way God intends authorities to act are for the protection of the innocent, to keep peace, to keep order, to judge the guilty and protect the vulnerable. Here we see Pilate stuck. He wants to do the right thing. In fact, he almost seems very drawn to Jesus and troubled by the reality that a divine one may be standing in front of him. But all it takes is one accusation from the religious leaders to say, if you let him go, you're no friend of Caesar's, you're no friend of the empire. And it's as though Pilate is shaken back into his reality. Rather than protecting the innocent, he is most interested in maintaining his position of power. And unfortunately, the other contrast we see is the religious leaders, the embodiment of the church, if you will, who ought to be the ones who also live out the suffering servant narrative, who, in the words of Jesus, take up the cross and follow him, who are the embodiment of a different way in the world. But unfortunately, what we have to wrestle with in this text as well is the way the people of God so often are more a reflection of the powers that shape Pilate than they are a reflection of God's powers. And so as you think about this week, I would love for you to wrestle with this idea of the church as the suffering servant. in reflection of Christ, the ultimate suffering servant. I think you should ask a question about in what ways does what Jesus goes through and the kind of reign that he puts in place, in what ways is Jesus bringing healing to the world? How is this stripes, how are these stripes and this wounding, how is this a healing suffering for the sake of the world? And then the second question out of that would be, then how are we as God's people invited into a kind of healing suffering? Another question, if you want to wrestle with it tonight, is the question of how should authorities like Pilate act in the world? When we as Christians become people in positions of authority and power, how should that authority operate? And what do we learn maybe negatively about the way that Pilate responds in this situation? We can't help but have power. We can't help but have influence, authority in the world. But the question these texts raise is, are we going to use that power for our own good? Are we going to use that power to accumulate more power? Or are we going to use that power, that influence, to bring healing and restoration in the world? Jesus had all authority, but he gives it up for the sake of the redemption of humankind, to heal you and me. Would love for you to talk about how that healing takes place and how we too can be reflections of that healing. Bless you as you have your conversation tonight.